and also author of all sorts of articles and chapters on social justice in the church, and a well-known activist and excellent speaker. Thank you so much, Winnie, for joining me today. The plan here is that I'm going to do a bit of an introductory talk, and then we'll have a conversation, and then we'll break into groups and have some discussion. And we'll be recording the first part of this, but not after we break for discussion. Thank you all so much for being here. This series is part of Living God's Future Now, which is the Heart Edge mini online festival of theology, ideas and practice. There's lots more to find out about, all sorts of talks, groups, Zoom sessions on the Heart Edge website or the Facebook page, and loads of ways to get involved. And Ben already has or will be posting details in the chat of how you can find out more if you'd like to. Heart Edge, we are developing this series as a response to the pandemic and our changing world. With the church having to change too, and as we improvise and experiment, the idea is to get together and improvise and learn and support each other. So this is Living God's Future Now, talks, workshops and discussions hosted by Heart Edge to equip, encourage and energize churches at the heart and on the edge. I'm delighted that St Bride's, one of my churches in Liverpool, is becoming a Heart Edge partner church in the Northwest. So that's the introduction to the series. To the general series that this is part of. This particular series of seminars on difference. There's going to be 4 Friday afternoons in July. It'd be great if you can come to all 4 of them, but if you can just dip in and out or just come, I mean, this might be not at all what you were expecting, in which case feel free not to come back another week. But it's perfectly possible as well just to come to 1 or 2 or 3 of them. And it's focusing on this question of how we think about difference theologically. So inevitably, we will be talking and thinking about some of the big differences that are currently pulling apart our churches and our world. You know, arguments about race and racism, about gender, about trans rights, all that kind of thing are bound to come up and will be some of the examples that we look at. But what I'm hoping to do is to look underneath those different sort of presenting issues, because all through, I'm a historian first and foremost, and all through the history of not just the church, but of all societies, there have been different issues, some very similar, some very different, which we've had deep arguments about. And I want to try and think beneath those, how we think about difference theologically. It seems to me that there's a fundamental paradox about difference, that we both need difference, we need diversity, and at the same time, we fear it. We need difference like we need a healthy, balanced diet, keeps us healthy. There's a long history of horror stories in which everything becomes the same and how deathly that is. Think, for example, of the story of King Midas turning everything he touched into gold, and then dying of starvation because he couldn't eat anything. It's a morality story about not being able to eat money, but it's also a morality story about how deathly sameness is. Difference has formed our world. I mean, that's a truism, it's obvious. Differences of gravitational pull, of temperature and materials have determined the whole ways in which our universe we exist, and the ground that we speak on has been formed and continues to be shaped. Our very existence as a species is the result of difference. As we've understood more and more about evolution, we've realized just how much humans and every other species that we share this planet with have evolved and continue to evolve as a result of the interactions between differences in our genetic material when we breed, and the different situations and environments in which we're placed. And of course, in our economic life, economic exchange is driven by difference. And then the economic development that trades and specialism bring is a primary driver of culture and the arts. We need difference, and yet we are terrified of it. And so much of what we do is driven out of that fear of the other. and that desire that we have to label the other in order to control it and separate ourselves from it and know where we're protected. It seems to me, as I said on the blurb for this, that there's a declension of difference. I might say, I am different. I'm proud to be different. You bring a kind of welcome diversity. I'm very pleased that you're around. It's nice that we have the diversity that we have between me and you. He, she, or they are deviant. And I'm fascinated in what is it that we form those value judgments on? What makes welcome diversity tip over into feared deviance? And it seems to me that the history of Christianity demonstrates that we've always struggled with how to deal with difference, whether we're burning heretics or forming the Lambeth Conference because we can't quite work out how to deal with the fact that different churches are developing in different directions. We're not good at handling difference, and that's very frustrating, because looking at our sacred texts and looking at our theology, it should be something that we're good at. We have a lot of theological resources in our tradition which are precisely about handling difference, theologically, and also particularly in the English philosophical tradition, pragmatically. We can see in the New Testament Gospels and letters the writers grappling with a very early process of theological reflection over all sorts of contentious issues, and then having the courage, and I think this is astonishing, to leave the record of those debates and those arguments in what became canonized as sacred texts, even when the debates and arguments weren't actually settled. Dealing with difference was a huge theme in the early church. The development of penitential theology in those first centuries was the result of the early church having to deal with different responses to persecution. And the very concept that there's something called orthodoxy, which you either obey or deviate from, was developed in the 3rd and 4th centuries as the early church and the Roman authorities wrestled with how much diversity of belief and practice was compatible with what we might today call social cohesion. Then from very early on in the history of missions, before we get into the kind of modern era and missionary societies and so on, the very early history of missions very, very rapidly led to questions of enculturation. There's some lovely correspondence in the early 7th century between Augustine of Canterbury and Pope Gregory about how much it's okay to adapt Roman practice to a new context. And in, I don't know how many of you be interesting to find out in the chat later, but in the Anglican context that I speak in the Church of England context that I speak from, the Church of England's settlement was very largely driven under Elizabeth I by a pragmatic desire to keep the peace, simply to maintain community cohesion. And Richard Hooker's Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity, which are in many ways the classic founding documents of the Church of England, although they don't have any official status, raised this idea of pragmatism to theological principle, that the purpose of the way we order the church is to maintain unity and calm and peace. And it goes back to that Old Testament idea, everyone's sitting under their own fig tree in their own space, that what most people want is to live in peace, and that the purpose of ordering the church properly is to make sure that that continues and that religion doesn't destroy huge swathes of the population, as of course they'd seen in the wars of religion on the continent. We've got the whole background of the toleration debate in the 17th, the 18th and the 19th centuries about how far variant religious opinions and practices could be allowed, how freedom of thought could be compatible with national security. So many of those arguments that we have now about Sharia law and all this kind of thing are very reminiscent of the arguments that we had back in the 18th and 19th centuries about whether Roman Catholics should be allowed to practice, because wasn't their loyalty to another crown. And those debates, those toleration debates, were hugely influential in the development of the Church of England's theology, but also in wider political philosophy in England and Europe. the Lambeth conferences met explicitly because of this question of how we handle difference. I spent some time on a sabbatical a couple of years ago reading through the reports from the early Lambeth conferences. And whilst there was some terrifying racism in some of the debates and sermons, there was also this really strong theme of it being at the core of the Anglican Communion that we accept that different churches will handle themselves differently, will set themselves up differently because they will adapt to local context. And actually quite a surprising amount of understanding that was at the nature of the kind of Anglican project, that churches have the right to self-determination. This is the Archbishop of Canterbury, Benson, in his opening address of the first Lambeth Conference. He quotes approvingly Gregory's letter in response to Augustine's question about how far he could adapt things. Pope Gregory said, choose what you find best and what will be useful. And he says, the Anglican Communion is brilliant because of the manifoldness, what a word, the manifoldness of the church, the embracingness, the versatility with which she enters into the life of new nations. And interestingly, the steadfastness of the claim that she makes for other churches as well as for herself, that they may have liberty in things doubtful or indifferent. This is kind of at the heart of our identity as Anglicans. But it seems to me that we very rarely use these resources in the heat of our current debates. Now, perhaps that's not surprising. Yeah, I'm not expecting people on the ground of a Black Lives Matter protest to be discussing what Archbishop Benson said in the opening address to the first Lambeth Conference. But in our internal debates, we're constantly surprised by our arguments. We're constantly saying they're unprecedented, and we're constantly refusing to engage with the resources that we already have got. So my hope in this series is that we will be able to think about those theological resources and how we handle profound difference. And when we go into breakout groups, I will be asking you to let me know what resources are your go-to for handling difference. So in this series, what I'm hoping to do is to take as our starting point on the different weeks some of the underlying ideas about difference that we can identify when we look back through the history of theology and cultures. And it seems to me that one of the key things that we can use to separate out these different ideas are how we make value judgments about which differences are good and which differences are bad. And that's deliberately childlike language because it's speaking to the kind of gut instinct that so many of us have behind our decisions about these things. Because nobody thinks that all difference is bad. We often, we like the fact that there's a rich tapestry of life. But for all of us, at some point, differences tip over from being something that we accept and enjoy to something that we make value judgments about. And I think there are 6 key approaches that you can see expressed not just in Christian history, but in lots of different belief systems and cultures. Purity. Things are good so long as they are themselves, but bad so long as they get mixed up. Hierarchy. Things are good so long as they fit into the accepted hierarchy, but bad to the extent that they challenge that or don't fit in. Aesthetics, the idea that it's good that there are differences because we need light and shade, but bad differences are the ones that make things ugly rather than make things beautiful. Toleration, the idea that differences are fine so long as they don't get in the way of somebody else expressing their ideas, and differences are fine so long as they don't endanger the community. And then 2 slightly different ideas, economics and evolution, which we'll look at in the last session. So we'll take purity and hierarchy as our starting points next week when I'll be joined by Calvin Samuel, and then the week after we'll look at aesthetics and toleration with Evie Vernon, and then economics and evolution in the final week. And I was going to say something now about the doctrine of the Trinity and why that used to be thought of 20, 30 years ago as kind of the solution. you know, oh, the doctrine of the Trinity holds together diversity and unity in this beautiful balance, and so that is the answer to multiculturalism. And I don't think it is. But I think I've talked for long enough now, so I want to bring Winnie in now and ask her what she's thinking so far and what theological resources you'd use, Winnie, in thinking about difference. You're still muted though.
Well, first, hello. Good to be here. Good to be here with all of you, and thank you for this invitation. One thing we didn't talk about actually in preparing for this that I'll just say is that this weekend in the United States is our Independence Day weekend. July 4th is Independence Day, and so today and Monday are holidays for many of us. And Independence Day for us, you know, that we all memorize the Declaration of Independence in school, and this might speak to I think what we're talking about maybe at a slightly different angle. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, is the second line of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. That was heard very differently by Thomas Jefferson than it would have been by an enslaved person in that same year. Thomas Jefferson, you know, the people that were writing the Declaration of Independence didn't see themselves, I mean, understood those terms very, very differently, did not see themselves as creating a document that created opportunity for difference, for diversity, for indigenous people in the Americas, which there were many, many of at the time that this was written, for enslaved people, for immigrants coming. These colonies were quite diverse as well, right? So depending on where you had come from as an immigrant, you had different rights. They meant land-owning men, which is what the law meant at the time. Of course, now, this many years later, and even 100 years after, and 50 years after, Americans have taken those same words to mean something quite different. So we haven't changed the Declaration of Independence. We haven't even changed the language of our Constitution. We've interpreted the words to mean something else. So who is human and worthy of rights and dignity? And those are theological propositions as well as legal propositions, which is what we discussed in preparing for this. How often legal propositions and the legal propositions that underlie the places that we live form our theology, whether or not we are aware of that or not. We might think we're writing about something more abstract, but often what we're writing about is how we understand ourselves within the legal systems that we function within. So for example, this idea that in general we don't like difference. One could argue that immigrants come to countries because they are quite curious and interested in difference and think they might thrive within it. So it's just a slightly different perspective, right? And then expect to live with all kinds of diversity and difference and make their lives in that way and make their children's lives in that way. So the perspective that difference isn't liked or has restriction might have more to do with who you are under the law, where you are settled, what you understand is yours. So that the perspective I would bring, and I'd love to talk about today, is how we think about ourselves and how our imaginations might be limited by how we function as citizens of the places that we are, who has rights, who doesn't have rights, and who among us believe that it is within our authority to grant additional rights to other human beings, to begin to change the definition of men in our document to be quite literal.
Absolutely, because we were talking yesterday in preparation for this, and we were talking about just how much our imagination gets formed by the legal system that we live in. And it's very interesting because what you were saying about those words not changing, and even in some ways the definition of them not changing. It's not that the words have changed their definition, it's that the context in which we understand them has changed. It was very much where I was going with some of the work that I originally did on the Doctrine of the Trinity, which kind of led me to this broader interest in difference. You know, at no point does the doctrine of the Trinity change, but what people understand by it completely changes. And my particular interest in it was from this angle of how we think about how we live together as people. Because when I was growing up, theology was all about, you know, oh, the Trinity is going to solve multiculturalism. And of course, when you look back through history, at any part in history, people have said, oh, because God is Trinity, this particular way that we organize government and society is exactly how it should be. This is exactly how God has ordained it. We tend to canonize what we think of as common sense. We then just say, oh, well, that's the way that God's ordained things.
Well, and then it depends so much also, or it's interesting to consider. again, who we center and don't. And then when we make a theological proposition and convince people, how if the church can hold itself accountable to that. So my example for that is maybe 6 years ago, I think I'm not good with years. It's 2014 or 2015, but I think 2014 when in our country, BLM is about has emerged out of the killing of Michael Brown in St. Louis, in Ferguson, and the activism that emerged immediately afterwards. And the power of that is the compelling piece of that image is just a young man's body, dead on the street, left for hours, and the community gathering around it, unable to get close to it, taking a while to get to a story, a person demonized very soon afterwards for why he might have been murdered, but with no cause that would have meant that murder was the right response. A police officer charged with murder, or charged and found not guilty. So that summer, that was that next summer that death happened. This police officer is tried, which is very unusual in our country, and a pretty profound and powerful movement begins to emerge in the US. And it's not clear where it's going to go, because this has happened many, many times. In my life, it's happened many times. So in the history of our country, it's happened many times. But the day that the result of the jury the trial ends and it's announced that the officer is found not guilty, I was at home in the rectory of the church where I served, and our children were home, and we watched it together. And they were teenagers at university age, and the shock on their faces, that was possible. Like, we all saw what happened, and the shock. I did not feel so shocked. And then you could hear almost immediately in New York City the streets fill up. We were in the East Village at the time at St. Mark's in the Bowery, and you could hear people come out enraged and sad, right? And so the next, and we kind of discussed whether or not to go outside or not, whether or not we should participate in this, and kind of held their grief, and then wrote to the church that we would gather in the morning if people wanted to decide what to do. So some people came in the morning, and we decided to make a huge banner that said Black Lives Matter. And I didn't think it through. I don't know anything about art. I'm not really good with numbers, as I've already said, or dates. But we had all this fabric, because we have huge pieces of fabric that swing through our church for Easter and other things that come out of, like many of us. So I took one of those bolts of white fabric, our daughter's an artist, and we started to line out Black Lives Matter. It took 27 feet to actually make in the end, which I had not thought through when we started. So it took the whole day. So we have this project on the front steps of our church, painting, lining out, painting, putting weights down, figuring out how to hang this thing up on our fence. It took the whole day. And church members came by, and community members came by to talk about it during the day. Early on, a young man from the church, young African-American man, raised by a white single mother in the middle of the country, Chicago, had come after university to work in New York, comes by and sees us working, and he's clearly kind of stressed and anxious and doesn't know what to do, and is helping us out. And he says, "You know what, Winnie, I'm gonna leave. Let me go help, because we have plenty of people here, and we know other people are gonna come to St. Mark's. But there are 6 Episcopal churches around us that I can walk to. They're going to need help. They don't have as many of us. So let me go see what they're doing, and I'll help. And then we'll come back and we can coordinate and whatever." And I paused for a moment thinking, do I tell him now that nobody else will be doing anything, that this is actually quite controversial? Or do I let him believe for another 30 minutes that what we preach in this church about who we care about and who we love and what, is true? Or do I let him come back confused and then we talk about it? Or do I tell him now, what I'm saying is aspirational. What we say on Sunday morning is aspirational, and we're not quite there yet. And so again, when we talk about difference, it's not just it's not conceptual, right? It's like, who do we line up with? Who are, if we talk about the diversity of the Trinity and mean that to say that diversity of experiences of power and powerlessness and margin within our society are contained in the theological framework of our church and our communion, and we stand in unity for all of that diversity, that's a proposition about who we are on the ground, right? And the truth is, for that man, right, and for that community, we were very alone. And that sign that we hung up, it took us the whole day to get it up, was taken down. That 27 feet of fabric was gone by the next morning, because it was not okay to make that statement in our progressive, urban, diverse New York City context.
It's really interesting as you're saying that. I can see on the screen here 3 or 4 people from our Open Table community in St. Bride's in Liverpool, which is a community of the LGBTQIA+ community, and just really resonating with that actually when someone joins that community, I quite often have the conversation, as do others, quite quickly, where people suddenly go, hang on, are you saying the rest of the church doesn't agree with this? And are genuinely horrified. And it's embarrassing. Yeah, one of the things I've been thinking is how much we get this message, and we saw it again very recently in the recent Black Lives Matter protest, didn't we? But you know, I've heard it for many years from a point of view of being a woman in the church, that unity, but we quickly moved to saying diversity and unity, yes, but actually what we really want is unity. And therefore, if you're making a fuss or saying anything that might upset other people, you're the problem. Because actually it's very easy to pathologize the fact that someone's saying, actually the status quo is not okay. And we talked a bit, didn't we, Winnie, about the idea of actually who's making those decisions, who's choosing, who's centering whose experience as the yardstick that other people, that we get to decide that this diversity is okay and that diversity isn't. Because effectively what we seem to see, and we're seeing it again on, I mean, anyone who's on Twitter or so on, we see this all the time. You know, Black Lives Matter, oh, well, are you saying all lives don't matter? You know, you go to a domestic abuse training session and within 3 minutes, somebody will have said, well, men get abused too, you know. You know, we just seem incapable of not centering white privileged male experience. I don't know if you want to say that.
Yeah, and I think we have talked a little bit about this. I think what we confuse is the legal position of, you know, of this original statement, right, of the power of white men under the law, right, and the assumption of innocence for white men under the law, that we actually haven't shifted, and the legacy that we have. We inherit the English legal system as well, that it was a very particular kind of white man, right, with property, and it was a very particular character that had privilege under the law. And one of the things I think we don't explore well enough in theology is it's not about the nice guy that, you know, that I work with, and it's not about the nice white men in my family. That's not what that we confuse that with and I think in theology we should think about the law, frankly, because that's actually where we're getting our sense of how power works. Like that's what we're talking about, and we're functioning within that system, these legal systems that we're a part of. And it doesn't actually matter, frankly, how nice we are to one another, how kind we are within our context, if that legal system frames everything that we do, including our imagination. And when people can think outside of that or resist that, what we see is not a lack of unity. What we see is a lack of order. And order is a power play always, right? And we are a very orderly system, right? Our church is very orderly, our nations are orderly, and I'm for order as much as the next person. But you could have unity of everyone on the street together, right? You could do that. That would be unity. That wouldn't be order. Like if we're all marching together for Black lives. And so I think unity actually has a lot of capacity for creativity within it, which is why unity and diversity can work together. It doesn't mean we have to be of one opinion about everything. We can stand together in solidarity quite profoundly with people whose experiences are not ours, and challenge us.
But what we can't do, it seems to me, is stand together in solidarity and have any meaningful unity with people who deny the very personhood of some of the other people. So you can have different, and this is I think one of the problems, because so many of our debates are around different opinions, as if we simply had different opinions about things. But when you're talking about whether a woman is a person or not, which was the 19th century debate, or whether you're talking about whether a Black person is a person or not, which is a scarily modern debate, and actually even now still quite live, even though technically it's not. Or whether you're talking, I mean, the big thing in my context at the moment is debates about trans rights and whether people really have the right to be a person in the way they choose to define. And you can't have that kind of unity and diversity and it's all very nice, we'll be friends and respect each other, when fundamentally one party is about privileging someone's opinion and one is about someone's identity.
Right. I completely agree with that. I was just in a conversation with theologians actually earlier today, and it's 11 o'clock in the morning on this topic. And what they were talking about calling our church, the Episcopal Church, to become more Christian. And that's to the point that you're making, that the the point of the church is not the order of the church. The point of the church is the salvation of the church and our salvation, right? That we are working towards the recognition of our own humanity. And part of this, for me, this framework of understanding what our legal history has been and who we are in it, what's privileged, what's not privileged, is our humanity is bound up in that and limited by it. If only some are perfectly human, right? A particular kind of body, a particular kind of sexual orientation, a particular kind of gender expression, no one actually fits completely neatly into that. There's some part of ourselves that we repress to make that possible. And then depending on how you're packaged and how God has made you, how you come into the world, there might be more and more parts of that humanity that you repress to be orderly and acceptable. These are all, I would say, fundamentally unchristian ideas. These are legal ideas presented to the church, and the church absorbs them. There's a capacity to be human in great diversity. I love the word you use, deviance, that is within all of us. I do not find that there's any lack of capacity for that in straight white men, frankly. There's a lot of capacity to be fully who we are outside of the restriction of what good order is, that calls us to our full humanity. And so that can be just fun and light at one level, if we have enough privilege to claim that. But for many, that's risking your life, right? That's death-defying. I was in a conversation with a Black trans woman yesterday who said, when I walk down the street in Brooklyn, there's someone in their 20s, right? The age of my children. People are afraid to be close to me, to my body, if I present in this way, because they will be accused, it'll be assumed that they are engaging in sex work in some way. They might be stopped by the police. I might be stopped by the police. People literally cannot get close to me and be in relationship with me without there being some threat of policing because of my presentation. I am illegal. The body is illegal. And so theologically, can we get our heads around that there are expressions of humanity, including people who are illegal by the law in our country if you come without papers, who that affects our theological imagination as well. I'm physically under threat. I am less safe if I engage that person. There are plenty of people like that in the space that I'm in. And that's not just about thinking about difference, right? That is about, can we imagine putting ourselves in solidarity with that person? Can we stand alongside them? Can we imagine ourselves with them? That piece to me is not completely intellectual. And it's also interesting to me that the first thought often in the church is, how do I point back to the most conservative position and say, how are we in solidarity with that? That's not what solidarity is. Solidarity is by definition with the powerless. So with the person, I cannot be in solidarity with someone who doesn't have less power than me. So then you have to be looking at that power as well, right?
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Winnie. So we'll go to breakout groups now for 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and have a bit of a plenary. If there are questions that you want to ask either Winnie or I, then you can put them in the chat, and we'll have feedback from the groups and that conversation.
Way to think about it, just period, just in our own self-interest. So if we cannot think about true diversity in our church, it's not just that it's unjust. Our children don't want to be a part of a segregated institution. Doesn't reflect the reign of God's justice. It's also just not literally economically possible.
Brilliant. Well, it's 5:15, so I think we will begin to wrap things up there. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you so much, Winnie, joining us from New York through the wonder that is Zoom. Absolutely brilliant. I hope you'll join us again for the next session. We've got 3 more sessions of this. You might think we've said everything there is to say about diversity. I don't think we have. We'll try and get into some of those particular paradigms and try and sort of tease out some of the differences I think there are between them. And I'm going to be in conversation next week with Candle Samuel from the Methodist Church, and we'll be thinking about purity and hierarchy specifically as kind of ways of thinking about what's good difference and what's bad difference, and how helpful or problematic those are. Thank you very much for coming, and might see you next week, might not. If you've got any other feedback that you haven't typed in, do stick it in now. Thank you. Kath, did you have your hand up, Kath?
I was applauding Winnie and you. It's been brilliant. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Give us a round of applause.